Good afternoon. I'm Harpreet Singh, Acting Associate Director for Cancer in Older Adults and Special Populations at FDA's OCE. This session will focus on study design and particularly studies with registrational intent, or studies designed to submit to the FDA for review. I will provide an overview of the 2020 FDA draft guidance for industry on inclusion of older adults in cancer clinical trials. Remember that the goal of geriatric oncology is to improve the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer, which translates into an improvement of the quality of care which older adults receive, which can and certainly should occur in the context of clinical trials. The FDA has a long-standing support for the inclusion of older adults in clinical trials across all therapeutic areas, with guidances dating back to 1997. The oncology group in particular has highlighted key eligibility criteria, such as patients with organ dysfunction or prior or concurrent malignancies, which have particular relevance to older adults, and that final guidance was published in 2020. In March 2020, the FDA released a draft guidance for industry specifically on inclusion of older adults in cancer clinical trials. The impetus for this guidance came from the 2017 co-sponsored FDA ASCO workshop on cancer in older adults, in which we heard from investigators and industry sponsors that they wanted very specific guidance on how to include older adults in cancer clinical trials in all phases of drug development. The guidance is based on the premise that adequate representation of older adults is necessary to determine the benefit risk of cancer therapeutics in this population. The guidance is divided into three major sections or phases of drug development: early clinical development, which you heard about in an earlier session in this workshop; clinical trials with registrational intent, which will be the focus of this section; and collection of post-marketing data through additional trials, registries, and or real-world data, which will be the focus of a later session in this workshop. The general recommendations are to include a representative population, including those patients with frailty. We are often asked, what is a representative population? And to that, we say that your strategy for inclusion of older adults should be informed by, first, the prevalence of the condition. Breast cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, lymphomas, and multiple myeloma are examples of diseases in which there is a significant proportion of older adults at the time of diagnosis. Unfortunately, in most clinical trials submitted to the FDA for registrational intent, we do not see an adequate representation of older adults in these populations. Sponsors and investigators should also look at diagnosis and treatment patterns, prior and relevant studies, and expected differences in safety and efficacy outcomes. This points back to enrolling an adequate representation of older adults in early phase clinical trials to determine if there are any expected differences in safety and efficacy. Clinical trials with registrational intent should design their trials with a focus on inclusion of older adults, which includes flexible approaches to trial design and considerations for patient perspectives, including endpoints, which may not always be your traditional overall survival or progression-free survival endpoints. This will be the focus of the subsequent presentation of Dr. Sridhara's presentation. Recruitment strategies should consider geography of clinical trial sites, go where older patients are, format and content of informational material, and that includes accommodations for visual and hearing impairments, caregiver support, and also a consideration to recruit investigators with expertise in the care of older adults with cancer. There are certainly many here at this workshop. Assessments and reporting should be developed and reported in more discrete age groups, such as 65 to 69, 70 to 74, etc., as opposed to just above and below 65, as this is not adequately informative. There should also be consideration for elements of geriatric assessment tools where feasible. There's a great deal of data on the value of this and certainly could be an additional component to ECOG performance status, which we know is a crude measure of functional assessment. We also are asking for more detailed labeling in the geriatric use section, and here is an example of a recent breast cancer approval in which there were higher rates of grade 3 to 4 hyperglycemia in patients over 65. And of note, there were not enough patients over 75 in the trial to make adequate assessments. Post-market considerations is the focus of a subsequent session in this workshop, but certainly could be accomplished with post-marketing trials examining broader populations or real-world data if there is inadequate information in the pre-market trial. Certainly that's not our preference, but we really need to get this data. Finally, Project Silver is OCE's initiative, which encompasses all of our efforts to improve the older evidence base for older adults with cancer and includes regulatory policy, advocacy, and outreach, global engagement, as well as our research and publications. It was inspired by the ASCO special article in 2015. Opportunities for systematic change include multi-stakeholder engagement, like this workshop, which will lead to systematic actions and a culture change, which should in turn rapidly close the evidence gap that exists for treating older adults with cancer. Thanks.